Slow start. So welcome everyone, and on behalf of Climate Bonds, many thanks for joining us for the Around the World case studies on subnational labeled bond issuances for cities, our training webinar. My name is Alicia, I'm the head of events and training at Climate Bonds, and we have joined the program Making Cities Resilient 2030, MCR 2030 for the ones that know well, a 10-year-long initiative to strengthen the resilience of cities around the world. Our mission is to create a tailored training for local governments about thematic label bonds as innovative debt instruments to finance climate change developing infrastructure in the cities. Now, our first webinar happened in October, The Power of Resilience, Developing Local Sustainable Finance, and it gathered a few of the main organizations supporting cities and municipalities finance, as well as partners of the MCR 2030. That webinar is available online in the Climate Bonds Initiative YouTube and our MCR 2030 dashboard for the participant cities, and I will also just share the link in the chat box. The webinar of today is the second and last one of the series, and it was designed to showcase key examples of thematic label bond issuance by subnational entities to address both climate resilience and infrastructure investment gaps. We will analyze different experiences from government bodies when issuing green social sustainability debt instruments and various jurisdictions worldwide. And we will hear an experience of two amazing guest speakers, which we will introduce very soon. Throughout the webinar, we will have a few polling questions presented by Isabella, our training manager. And please do use the Q&A box to enter your questions, and we'll dedicate time to answer as many questions as we can. Also, feel free to use the chat box if you would like to share with us experiences that you or your city had issuing labeled bonds. Now let's get into it. Our Abraham Pedrosa is the Climate Bonds lead trainer and ambassador of our capacity building program to accelerate the dissemination of our knowledge and financial instruments and drive sustainable finance and investment agendas toward climate action. Prior to Climate Bonds, he worked at the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, in different agendas contributing to sustainable development and climate mitigation issues, and they're linked to the global political arena. His educational background includes an MSc degree in policy analysis from Delft University Technology in the Netherlands, an MSc degree in network industries and numerical economy from the École Polytechnique in France, and he received the BSc degree in engineering from the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico. And with you now is Isabella Rolla, training manager, to launch our polling questions. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Alicia. Welcome, everyone. So as Alicia mentioned, my name is Isabella Rolla. I'm the training manager of the Climate Bonds Initiative. And as Alicia mentioned, we are working to deliver the tailored capacity building program to support the resilience of the cities, part of the MCR 2030 program. So we're going to ask you a few questions throughout the session to support this with the design of our course. And I'm going to start with the following one. Okay, please let me know if you can see the polling question in your screens. Yeah? Very well. So in your opinion, what's the key bottleneck for thematic labeled bonds issuances by local governments? Do you think it's a lack of green, social, and sustainability bonds available in the market or project pipelines? Do you think that is a lack of aggregation mechanisms for green, social, and sustainability projects? Or is a lack of green, social, and sustainability bonds definition and framework available? Or perhaps information and market knowledge? Or finally, clear risk profile of green, social, and sustainability investments. We're going to give you another 20 seconds to go through this one, and then we can start our presentation. Okay, I see numbers rising. Very well. Okay, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, Abraham, to start with, we have very different reasons, right, to prevent or as challenges for thematic labeled bonds issuances by local governments. And this is precisely what we're going to discuss in this presentation. So thank you very much for this first round of answers, and welcome to our session.
Good. Thank you very much, Alicia, for your kind welcome, and thank you very much, Isabella, for providing us information about the different poly questions that we're going to be having throughout the session. I just want to highlight to the audience that your answers are very important for us, because this webinar is part of a bigger project, and in that sense, your inputs in relation to cities bonds are going to be very, very helpful for the development of a more comprehensive training on this space. Well, I would like to also say hello, everyone. Welcome on my side, and also on behalf of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I would like to welcome you to this webinar on labeled bonds as mechanisms to address local governments' climate resilience and infrastructure investment gaps. We thank you sincerely for being here, for being part of the movement to accelerate financing in sustainable development. As my colleague Alicia already mentioned, my name is Abraham Pedrosa, and I'm the lead trainer at the Climate Bonds Initiative, which, as you might know, is an organization that is strongly committed to actively support the sustainable finance agenda with the purpose of achieving the global goals. Today, we have a very special session, as I'm accompanied by two colleagues, Mike Brown and Cedric Rimaud, who later in the session will be sharing with all of us their experience in issuing thematic debt instruments at local levels, and which I'm certain will be very, very useful for all of us to better understand the challenges, the obstacles, but most importantly, the benefits of issuing these innovative instruments. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your kind support and for being here. So just before taking you through the agenda that we have for our webinar session, I would also like to take this opportunity to express our sincere appreciation for the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction for having us with them here today, and for teaming up with the Climate Bonds Initiative in this highly, highly important project. So just briefly, we would like to kindly remind you that the content of this webinar session and its material is confidential and intended for this and only this webinar session. And we invite you to contact CBI for any further data protection queries that you may have. Okay. Now, to quickly start with the content of our session, the elements that you see on your screen are the different sections and topics that we have for this webinar. In the first half of the session, we will cover the theoretical part of this webinar, okay? And in this first part, we will provide a rather brief introduction of the labeled bond universe for those who might not be very familiar with this space. And after that, our session will mainly focus on the use and issuance of green bonds, as this can be considered the most mature debt instruments in the market. Okay, so in that sense, we will use a green bond to illustrate the steps in the issuance process of a labeled bond at the local level. And we will talk about elements to have in mind at pre-issuance, issuance, and post-issuance phases. The second part of our webinar will give the opportunity to our guest speakers to share with all of us their experience related to labeled bonds in a local context. We will first hear about the challenges, opportunities, and supporting mechanisms and infrastructure as well, supporting the issuance of bonds in this format. And we will close our webinar by hearing about a subnational green bond case study coming from the city of San Francisco. Okay. So as you can see, we have a rather comprehensive and interesting agenda to cover in the next couple of hours. But well, just to start our session, the theoretical part of our session, I think it is very important to take one step back and recognize where we stand today and to understand the state of play that we find ourselves in and why the subject at hand today centers around the climate emergency. As societies, we are now more aware of the challenge that we are facing. We know that we are living in a momentum that is crucial for basically our survival. Climate change is a huge challenge, is a huge problem, and I don't think I need to tell anybody here that it affects everyone's life in some sort of form or fashion. We have been hearing from researchers, from scientists who have been warning us for already many years, for decades about this issue. We have also been urging our governments to act. We have also come to recognize the huge costs that come with the effects of climate change. And of course, this is not only down to environmental issues, but this is affecting practically all of our systems, our financial systems, our businesses, our economy as a whole. All of these are being impacted by climate change. So there is no single country in the world that is not being affected by climate change. When we hear about droughts in Africa or extreme fires happening in North America, when we hear about higher temperatures hitting Europe, and more powerful and frequent hurricanes or typhoons in Central America and in parts of Asia, among, of course, many other issues, it is evident that the time for action was yesterday. And in that sense, we need to scale up and speed up our efforts. There is no time for discussion or little steps. It is urgent that everyone takes clear and ambitious actions if we are to achieve the global goals. So in that sense, sustainable finance plays a very important role, a crucial role, I may say. And although we have these enormous challenges that I just mentioned in front of us, we do have an opportunity. And this opportunity is about being able to finance a transition and being able to come up with solutions and being able to invest in our economy adequately. But as stated in many international fora, such as the recent COP26 that took place in Glasgow, this is urgent, and gatherings such as the one that we're having here today are definitely a step in the right direction. And so what we will covering and talking about during today's session, during today's webinar, can perhaps help us move forward adequately, but it will be up to you, up to me, up to everyone basically to really do it as fast as we can, as fast as possible. So with this rather short context that I wanted to share with you, it's that we're gonna be talking about innovative debt instruments and how these instruments contribute to local governments' sustainable developments. We know that cities play a fundamental role in the fight against climate change. Therefore, the importance of this topic that we are discussing today. And we're gonna start our session with the graphic part of me that you see on your screen, which represents in a rather simple manner the current label bond universe. Okay, of course, the image that you see there can be arranged or structured a little bit different, but just the main objective here is for you to have an overall visual representation of the different thematic bonds, the different label bonds that exist in a market as of today. Okay. We have first at the top of the graphic, the social label that includes bonds whose proceeds have a main focus on delivering positive social outcomes. The labels used to describe this label may range from pandemic to gender inclusion, but all of them are covered within the social label. So for instance, we have there pandemic bonds, which are debt instruments that emerged in early 2020 in order to facilitate an immediate and effective response to the COVID-19 outbreak. You can also see there resilience bonds, although this can also nicely fit in the green spectrum. These bonds are in very simple terms instruments to reduce the human and financial cost of catastrophes when they strike. Okay. Then we have at the bottom of the graphic green bonds, which are in very simple terms instruments whose proceeds are dedicated to environmental and climate positive outcomes. We will talk a little bit more about these specific bonds in just a moment. But within this label, you can see and we can find, for instance, blue bonds that are used for projects and assets related to marine and coastal industries and ecosystems. You can also see their transition bonds, which are being currently developed to help high polluting industries to align with a low carbon economy. Okay? And finally, we have at the center the sustainability bond label, which covers bonds with proceeds directed to a mix of both green and social projects. And in here, we can talk about SDG bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, among others. Okay. So just to recap, the main difference between these labels lies on the fact that green bonds aim at having a positive impact on the environment, while social bonds aim at having a positive social outcome. And as said, sustainability bonds are simply bonds whose proceeds will be used to finance or refinance a combination of both green and social projects. But as said, this is just a very brief recapitulation of the bond universe, but throughout the webinar, we will be focusing on green bonds, who can be considered the most mature debt instrument in the market. Okay. Now, particularly on green bonds, although there is currently no universally agreed definition for these instruments, for green bonds or climate bonds, as they are also usually referred to, in a very simple way, green bonds are like any other conventional bond, except that the issuer promises to use the proceeds for green investments, for green projects, or eligible green assets. Okay. We're going to talk in a moment about what green means. You can see there in the slide examples of similar definitions coming from different pioneering institutions that are working in this field. For instance, you have there at the top the International Capital Market Association, ICMA, that defines green bonds as a debt instrument that exclusively uses the funds raised to finance or refinance green projects, assets, or business activities. We also have there the World Bank, who was actually one of the very first institutions issuing green bonds back in 2008. And this institution defines these instruments as a debt security that is issued to raise capital specifically to support climate-related or environmental projects. Okay. And more recently, the European Commission, with the work that it is carrying out in this space, defined green bonds as any type of listed or unlisted bonds or capital market debt instrument issued by a European or international issuer that is aligned with the EU Green Bond Standard. Okay. What is important to retain from these definitions that we presented here is that the primary purpose of green bonds is to raise finance for climate change mitigation or climate adaptation related projects, assets, or programs. Okay, so very important to have those aspects, those elements in mind. Now, to issue a green bond, there are some key steps to take into consideration throughout the process. Okay, but perhaps before going through those, it is important to clarify that from a financial perspective, the process of issuing a green bond or any other thematic bond, such as the ones that we just saw before, is the same as that of issuing a traditional bond, okay, a vanilla bond, pardon me, as they are also known. So, but in the case of green bonds, or in the case of label bonds, the label that is being attributed to the bond translates into some additional steps that, in this case, the issuer needs to take into consideration throughout the entire process. Okay. So in the pre-issuance phase for a green bond, there are two additional steps to take into consideration, which are the definition of the green bond framework and also the search for supporting mechanisms, which we're going to be discussing in detail in the following slides. Then you can see there that in the issuance phase, it is important to include the green attributes in marketing materials and also in investor documents in order to attract a broader pool of investors. We will also talk about this a little bit later. And finally, at the post-issuance phase, what is important to have in mind is that issuers must allocate the proceeds to the eligible projects under the agreement. They need to track the use of these proceeds, of course, and they should provide reports on this regard and perform an audit if necessary. Okay. And what you see here on this slide serves just to illustrate these additional steps. But again, we're going to be discussing this in detail in the following slides. Okay. Now, the steps that were shown in the immediate previous slide do also apply for sovereign or sub-sovereign issuances. Okay. However, when it comes to issuing sovereign or sub-sovereign bonds, when it comes to issuing this format, there are perhaps a couple of elements to consider, and this given the more complex, perhaps organizational nature of governments. Okay, so in this sense, for instance, the engagement of governmental stakeholders is key, as their collaboration is a central part in the process. In here, for instance, collaboration between ministries, such as the Ministry of Finance, or other pertinent ministries, such as the Ministry of Environment or Development, is fundamental because they may jointly set the goals for the green bond that is being issued. This is, of course, if we are talking about sovereign bonds, but if we are talking about sub-sovereign bonds or an issuance at the local level, then it is crucial to have representatives of different pertinent areas and departments from the local government. Okay, so in that sense, the idea is that all of the actors involved in the process may jointly identify the eligible expenditures and sectors. But important to highlight is that they will also have to follow similar monitoring and reporting practices as with any other bond, okay? And a similar, they will follow the similar steps as those that I mentioned in the previous slide, okay? So in principle, just to recap, the same steps that are to be followed by, for instance, a corporate green bond apply also for sub-sovereign bonds or sovereign bonds as well, with the difference that in this case, in the particular case of sovereign and sub-sovereign bonds, the involvement of government or local authorities, representatives is fundamental, okay? And that the issuance at a government level may refer to a national climate strategy or to a local climate strategy if we are talking about municipal or cities bonds, okay? Now let us see the process of issuing a bond that has been labeled green in detail, okay? And for that, we're gonna start with this slide. So by now we have covered briefly, very briefly, the definition of green bonds, and we cover also briefly the additional steps in regards to issuing in this format. But now let us have a closer look at each of these steps, okay? And this is, of course, just to set the scene prior to the intervention of our guest speakers in a moment. We're gonna be sharing with us a lot of insightful aspects of this agenda. So the first additional step in a green bond issuance process is the preparation of a green bond framework, okay? And this is a document that requests information on how the issuer internal processes align with the green bond eligibility criteria, okay? So think of this green bond framework as a simple document that is composed of different sections and different parts. And in this document, in the first part, you are to provide information on the process to be implemented at the pre-issuance phase. So namely, how the instrument, how your green bond aligns with the best international practices or existing protocols, okay? And how the bond is in line with the qualities that define a good quality green bond, okay? So that's the first part. Then the second part of the green bond framework requires information about the post-issuance phase, okay? Specifically about audit and reporting. So the green bond framework is just a physical document that is generally made publicly available to the market and can be considered the centerpiece of the green bond process, of the green bond issuing process, okay? And the boxes indicated from A to F are the different sections in the document template for which you would have to provide information. Now, as you might recall from a previous slide, from the slide where we touch upon the definition of the different label bonds, the main difference between a green bond and other label bonds is that for a green instrument, for a green bond, the proceeds are to be allocated to projects and assets that are considered green, right? So in that sense, it is crucial that as part of the steps in the process, the issuer identifies the projects and the assets that are eligible for inclusion in the bond. Okay, so the assets and projects that are climate aligned or that are, in simple terms, green. Okay, so for this purpose, there are very suitable tools in the market that can provide guidance on this regard. We have the so-called taxonomies, which role is in very simple terms, to classify and define assets and projects that are climate aligned or green, as I said before. So taxonomies provide a list of eligible assets with thresholds and metrics as necessary and when pertinent. And these are the list of assets and projects where proceeds can be allocated. Okay, so indeed, these instruments do provide very useful guidance to not only issuers, but also to investors and other pertinent stakeholders that are involved in the issuance process of a green bond. And they provide guidance on what investments to focus if these different stakeholders wish to contribute to a sustainable future, or to a low carbon economy future. Just to provide you an example of these instruments, there are different instruments in the market. CBI was the first institution putting a taxonomy out there, and this, of course, to help, as I said before, not only issuers, but also investors, governments, municipalities, of course, and other pertinent actors to understand what the key investments are that can deliver a low carbon economy. Okay, but since this taxonomy was launched, other similar and very useful instruments as well have emerged, which have definitely come to boost and strengthen the uptake of green bonds. Okay. An important characteristic of these instruments is that they are not static. Okay. On the contrary, they are constantly evolving as they need to reflect the arrival of new technologies. They need to reflect also the latest science available. For instance, CBI's taxonomy follows closely the research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, and many other experts in relevant fields. And it tries to reflect their findings to the best extent possible in its taxonomy. In the same line, these tools are consistent with a low carbon economy and with the targets that have been set by the Paris Agreement. And another important element to mention about CBI's taxonomy in particular is that this tool is not the result of the efforts that were carried out only by CBI, okay, but by the efforts that CBI has carried out jointly with an international community. Okay, on one hand, there are the technical working groups who are in charge of developing the eligibility criteria for each low carbon investment area that you can see there on your screen. And then on the other side, we have the industry working groups that provide sector-specific experience and also inputs and observations to ensure that the criteria that has been set by the technical working group is indeed practical and that is also conducive for the rapid diffusion of the products. The image that you see on your screen just illustrates how CBI's taxonomy looks like. You can observe that the taxonomy includes sector criteria for the energy sector, the transport sector, water, buildings, land use, and all, among others. So if you were interested in investing in these areas, you can have a look at it. It provides a list of eligible projects and assets that are aligned with a low carbon economy. But as said, this is only one of the instruments in the market. There are other similar instruments out there that are also contributing to determine what are the eligible projects that can be funded through green bonds. Okay. Now, another very important step in the process of issuing a green bond by local governments is the arrangement of an external review, okay? And this step, in rather simple terms, refers to the evaluation of the green credentials of your bond, okay? So in this step, a service provider assesses the green attributes of the bond, of your green bond, and determines its alignment with best international practices, okay? Almost all external reviews that are currently available in the market fall under the categories that you see there. We have second-party opinions, we have the assurance methodology as well, we have the certification alternative, and the scoring or rating process, which should not be confused with the credit assessment process that all issuers need to go through in order to assess the credit worthiness of their entity, okay? So in here, in this part of the issuance process, the scoring or rating methodology refers to assessing the green credentials of the bond, of the green bond, okay? And just briefly to provide you a bit of information on these different methodologies, because this is a crucial part in the issuance process of a green bond. We have first the second party opinion, okay, which this methodology provides an opinion on the framework that is being used for the bond, okay, and it also provides an opinion about the issuer's overall sustainability narrative. This approach is generally designed by the service provider in alignment with the green bond principles, but perhaps important to highlight is that the type of reviews can vary depending on the methodology used by the different service providers. Okay, there are different service providers in the market for second-party opinions. There's Sustainalytics, EGO Ares, ISS, OECOM, and many others. Okay, international, and also at the regional level, you can find some service providers for this. Then there is the assurance option, which is an assessment of the green credentials of the bond. And the main difference between this methodology and the second party opinion is that the second party opinion can also provide an assessment of the social and sustainability credentials of the green bond framework, as I said before. While in the case of assurance, on the assurance methodology, the reports that are being produced are only prepared to analyze the green or the climate credentials of the bonds, okay? You can see there some service providers. In here, we have the big four consulting companies, the big four consulting firms, E&Y, Deloitte, KPMG, and some others, and also Sustainalytics, who provide assurance, SPO reviews. It also provides assurance reviews. Then there is the external review in the form of a scoring or rating process, and this alternative consists of a report from a rating agency or any other specialized firm. And in here, this firm or the service provider scores the issuer's framework against an established range. Okay, so in here, rather than providing an opinion, as in the second party opinion or the assurance methodologies, in here the evaluator provides a numerical result, a grade as a result of the analysis. Okay. You can see there also some service providers. And finally, the last or the fourth option is the certification alternative, which is a formal endorsement of a bond's credentials and consistency with an accepted standard. For instance, the Climate Bonds Initiative offers a certification scheme where green debt instruments are verified to conform with the climate bond standard. And this slide here just presents some examples of second-party opinions, assurance, and the rating methodologies. You can see there an example of an SPO. We have there Cicero's Shades of Green, which is how that institution has named its evaluation methodology. This approach basically provides information on how well a green bond aligns with a low carbon resilient future, and to grade the results of their analysis, they provide either a light, medium, or dark green mark, as you can see in the image. Then there is the assurance option. And we can say that this is a more formalized approach because it usually follows or presents information as indicated in the second example. So for instance, you can usually find statements where the reviewer indicates that nothing has come to their attention that indicate that the green bond framework is not in accordance with the issuer's stated approach. Okay. And last, the third example is for a scoring or rating, which, as you can see, they provide a grade rather than a binary response on compliance as in the other methodologies. The certification methodology is slightly different because, as I said before, this is a formal endorsement of a bond's credentials and consistency with a national or regional regulations or an accepted standard as well. In practice, the certification process is divided in two phases. In the pre-issuance phase, the verifier provides a report that states whether the bond conforms to the pre-issuance requirements, in this case of the climate bonds initiative standard, okay? And upon approval, the issuer receives a formal certification letter as well as a certificate, which then can be used for marketing purposes of the bond. Again, this is very useful to attract a broader pool of investors. Then, in order to maintain certification, and this is perhaps one of the aspects that make this methodology a bit more stringent, is that after the bond has been issued, the issuers must comply also with the post-issuance requirements of the climate bond standard. And this translates in a verification that is conducted in the common months after the issuance of the bond. And by this time, the proceeds coming from the bonds must have been allocated to the selected projects and assets. Now, the next step in the issuance process refers to the mechanisms that the issuer needs to establish, to report, and also to manage and track the proceeds internally. In this regard, related to the tracking of the proceeds internally, there are two commonly used mechanisms to do this, to track the proceeds. On one side, we have the earmarking mechanism, in which the proceeds enter the finances of the issuer, and these proceeds are simply set aside for future allocation to the selected projects and assets. So in its most basic or simple sense, to earmark is to flag something, and in this case is to mark the proceeds for a specific purpose, okay? So for the use of those proceeds in the specific projects and assets that were agreed upon. Then you can see there a second alternative, which is called ring fencing, and this option is preferred when the issuer decides to separate the proceeds from its business as usual operations. So in very simple terms, in here, the issuer segregates a portion of the company's financial assets from the rest, okay? Now, in terms of reporting, or in terms of the reporting activity at the pre-issuance phase, in here, we talk about establishing the reporting processes that will be followed throughout the issuance process, okay? And as transparency is a rather critical aspect in the issuance process of a green bond, in here, issuers are encouraged to provide information on the scheme or the format that they will be following when reporting, okay? As well as providing information on the frequency of the preparation of these reports, okay? So in practice, these reports are provided on a regular basis, annually, most of the times. And you can see there a couple of publications that can provide additional guidance on this space should you be interested. Okay. Now, regarding the issuance phase, this phase starts when the bond is announced to the market, okay, and when the book is open. This book refers basically to a digital archive or a platform where orders from investors are taken, are noted. Then the issuer follows this process closely, because depending on the behavior of the market, they can decide to adjust or not the price of the bond. If there is a change, of course, in the price, this is announced to the market, and then the issuance operation is completed when there is a final agreement among those involved in the process: investors, issuers, banks, and others. Okay? What is important, perhaps, to highlight in this phase, in the issuance phase, is that when launching the green bond into the market, issuers are advised to include their green credentials or their climate attributes in the marketing materials. And again, as said before, this is to attract a broader range of investors. Okay. And finally, when the bond has been issued, the issuer needs to assign the proceeds to the corresponding account and track allocation over time, as we discussed before. And of course, the issuer needs to report on how the proceeds are being used. Now, the last slide that we have to cover this theoretical part of the webinar. This last slide refers to reporting again, but now in this case, it focuses on the post-issuance phase, okay? In here, it is perhaps worth noting that there are different approaches for reporting. For instance, there are reports that provide very detailed aspects of a program, and others that focus on providing only a summary. But again, the main point here, if I may say, is that the use of qualitative and quantitative performance measures is encouraged, okay? And we have seen more and more interest from investors in reporting practices. So this is a very much appreciated practice by the market. Good. Well, these are the elements that we wanted to cover before our interactive session with our guest speakers. We consider crucial, pardon me, to cover these elements, as we are aware of the fact that we have people coming from different backgrounds. So we just wanted to put this on the table for a smooth comprehension of the issuance process of a bond. Now, in the next part of our webinar, we will be able to hear from our guest speakers their firsthand experience in this process. They will be able to tell us more about the obstacles, as I said, the challenges, but more importantly, about the benefits when issuing a green bond. But before that, I believe we have another polling question, right, Isabella?
We do, Abraham. So yeah, this is to support us with the development of our course, right? So I'm going to launch here the next question for you. And the question is, if you work with local governments, please indicate below the topics that you would better contribute to your capacity building process. And that is to support your local government with thematic labeled bonds issuances. So you can check as many as you want, as many as you think are suitable for your capacity building process. So for now, we have here benefits, costs, and risks for issuers. What else, everyone? Okay. Contribution of local governments, really widespread right now so far. Types of thematic label debt instruments, the concepts of resilience. Very well. I'm going to give you another 15 seconds to answer our polling question. And thank you very much for contributing to the development of our course with your answers. All right, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so sharing the results. I guess that all of these topics are very welcome, Abraham, by the audience if they were to see that in a course in the future. So I'll pass the word to you once again so we can invite our guest speakers to the panel.
Pardon me, I think I was on mute. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Isabella, for launching the second polling question. Again, that information is very useful for us, as we have said already, for the development of a more comprehensive training course on this space. Now, I see there are some questions and answers in the pardon me, in the chat box. I'll address those by replying directly through the chat box. I would like to give more time to our guest speakers to share with us their experiences, because that's very relevant. We have seen the theoretical part, but we want to hear what's the real experience in the process. And well, now to move on to the second part of this webinar session, we have, first of all, our colleague, pardon me, Cédric Rimaud, who is the Climate Bonds Initiative ASEAN, pardon me, program manager, and he works with various stakeholders in that region in order to contribute to the development of the label bond market in that part of the world. So Cédric, thank you for being with us here today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Abraham. And I will need to share my presentation if you can close
Let
yours.
me just close mine. There you go.
So just a little bit of background, as Abraham was saying, I'm based in Singapore and I cover the ASEAN region, but some of my work involves interacting with other stakeholders. And recently, together with Dr. Chien, formerly from the Asian Development Bank, and Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, who is currently the chairman of the Pakistan Stock Exchange, we were asked to write a paper for the G20 task force on subnational governments. So we will share a link of this paper with you, but I would like to present some of the thoughts that we articulated in this short paper, in which we try to explain how it is possible to realign the subnational government's agenda towards climate resilience and how to use financial instruments to do so. So the good news is that green bonds are now on a very, very rapid ascent to become a significant part of the market. We expect at Climate Bonds Initiative that by 2023, there will be about $1 trillion of annual issuance of green bonds. And that's coming from a total issuance in November 2020 of $1 trillion. So as you can see, in a very few years, these green bonds have become very popular with issuers, but also with investors. And there is a lot of capital that is looking to invest in those instruments. The other good news is that at the national government level, a number of countries around the world have already announced and pledged that they want to reach net zero emissions, most of them by 2050, and some others around this target. So that means that at the national government level, the message has already been accepted that we need to rechange our economies and make them low carbon. Now, the question is, it's good to have a national policy because a number of infrastructure investments are decided and organized at the national level, but actually it's only part of the story. The subnational level is a very important level of policy making and investment decision that will transfer this capital that is raised at the national level to the local context with all the projects that are going to be invested and deployed in regions, in provinces, in states, and in cities. So the question is, how can we achieve that to make sure that the capital is really flowing through to reach the local level, where it really matters for the expansion of this market. Now, the role of subnational government is actually quite interesting because a lot of the investments that are needed will happen at the urban area. Taken from the Coalition for Urban Transitions, this graph explains that the low carbon investments that would cut emissions from urban areas by almost 90% by 2050 come only from a handful of sectors, most of all buildings. So transforming our buildings to low carbon real estate is very important in reducing the carbon footprint of our economic activity. And that's a good news because a lot of green bonds do finance green buildings because buildings have a relatively predictable cash flows with the rental income that they can generate from commercial leases, or if they are residential, by the rent that the owners pay every month. So a bond is very suitable for financing the construction of low carbon buildings. The second sector is transport for 21%. Again, that's good news. The bonds are a very good instrument to finance the deployment of transport solution and low carbon transport solution. We've seen a number of projects already being financed with green bonds. For example, in Thailand, the SkyTrain in Bangkok has been financed with the issuance of a green bond that has been very successful and has received a lot of investor interest. And there are many other examples around the world. Actually, I think the New York subway is also financed through a program of issuance of green bonds, which is also raising a lot of capital to deploy this kind of infrastructure. So the deployment of such investments can really be scaled up by raising the pace of capital that is flowing to those projects. And then we have some other sectors like materials efficiency and waste. So there are other types of technologies that would also be suited, but they would be on a case-by-case basis. But luckily enough, those two main sectors are actually the two largest sectors among the largest sectors that can be financed through green bonds, together with renewable energy as well. So still, according to this report from the Coalition for Urban Transitions, it is estimated that we almost need $2 trillion per year, or about 2% of global GDP, to reduce the emissions coming from cities. And through those investments, there will be return over time. This will be a good investment. They will produce some economic benefits, but we still need to mobilize capital at a relatively large scale. So $2 trillion a year for cities is actually coming in the order of magnitude with what we are expecting the green bond market to issue every year. So, it's not out of reach. It needs some more work, but it's still accessible. So from our paper and our discussions, we came up with a certain number of ideas. First of all, the climate policy and the legislation need to be supportive of subnational governments. There needs to be a long-term low-carbon pathways at the subnational level, together with some action plans that lay out how the investments must be implemented, and help by incentives to encourage climate adaptation and resilient infrastructure projects. This is very important. It's not only critical to have a national objective, it needs to flow through as well at the subnational level. And this can be done through legislation or policy implementation. The other important point is related to the fiscal transfer between national government and subnational government level. A lot of local governments rely on revenues that are transferred from the federal level to the local level. So it is important to implement policies that facilitate this flow of capital. What we see around the world is a lot of examples of sovereign green bonds being raised, and sometimes in very large sizes. The most recent from, for example, the UK or Italy have been relatively large. And even the EU has a program of raising a lot of green bonds in the future to finance infrastructure. So what is important is to find this way of transferring fiscal revenues that will allow the subnational level to also use these instruments and develop climate resilient infrastructure. On the flip side, and the positive side of it, is that these investments in low carbon and climate resilience infrastructure do offer a lot of economic and financial and social benefits. A lot of these investments are actually very sound investments. And I would like to take the example of a renewable energy project. If you have a subnational government, for example, a region or a city that has relatively poor supply of energy, it is difficult to support a lot of economic activity because businesses find it difficult. For example, if there's a lot of power cuts to support the economic activity, businesses will find it difficult to come to create their business and to set up manufacturing processes. So by developing new sources of energy from renewable energy projects, a province or region or a city can increase the economic activity that is happening within its boundaries, which means that there will be additional tax revenues perceived on this economic activity. So it is possible to imagine a system by which the local government would capture these future extra revenues that are derived from this new source of energy. And by capturing that, which those revenues will happen in the future, the best instrument to do that is to issue a bond, which will be repaid over time from those extra revenues that will be generated by this additional economic activity. So this is essentially a paper that we have recently published on what we call the spillover effect from power purchase agreements. So you can imagine a local government or a utility that is managing the electricity supply in a province or in a region to contract a power purchase agreement with a renewable energy project. So it could be solar, it could be wind, it could be biomass. And within this power purchase agreement, there could be a mechanism by which those future revenues that the local government will perceive through the tax revenues can be contributed to increase the payment included in this power purchase agreement. So initially, the local government will pay more than what is normally the case for such PPPs just because these new projects will bring additional economic activity and bring new tax revenues. And if it's relatively long dated, it's possible to spread that out over a longer time. So this graph essentially on the x-axis represents the time, on the y-axis represents the extra revenues. And the blue line that is in this graph represents the growth of tax revenues that the subnational government will perceive because of these new projects coming in its area. And not all tax revenues will be shared. In this example, only half of them will be shared. So the subnational government will continue to benefit from this additional activity. But by increasing the value of the PPA, it is a way to make those projects possible. So just to summarize, just because of a forward value of the economic benefit of such projects, we can increase the power purchase agreement feed-in tariff that will make those projects more feasible. And that's a way to really scale up the deployment of these projects. So something to, if you are in a situation where you are considering attracting renewable energy projects into your area, think about this forward view of how much extra revenues this will provide as additional tax revenues that will be contributed to your receipts. So actually, this question of the cash flows that are supporting the bonds is extremely important, because obviously a bond is a debt instrument, and with debt comes the responsibility to repay this debt. And there is a risk that if a sovereign or a subnational government takes on too much debt, it may default on this debt because of its inability to service it. And we have seen in the recent crisis actually a lot of stress being put on the ability of some sovereigns or even local governments to repay the debt because of the fall of economic activity. In 2020, we saw 6 sovereign issuers default on their debt. And there has been a number of initiatives like the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative that are trying to mitigate these impacts. And there are even talks about trying to create a swap where previously contracted debt could be exchanged against promises of acting on climate or on the SDGs. So that clearly there is a risk that this vulnerability may increase if too much debt has been created. But what is very important is that green bonds can be structured on projects that do have a positive economic value and that have future revenues. And there's a lot of cases where that could be the case, like I was explaining on the renewable energy projects, but also on, if you think of a transportation project, a railway or a subway or other projects where there is the sale of tickets for users that will be using the trains, that this is a source of new revenues that could be used as a support of contracting new debt without really impacting too much and being a burden on the fiscal purse of the government. So that's on the project side. And the last question that we looked at is how to find long-term investors that are interested in these kinds of projects. And for that, there is a number of issues as well. The first one is that in a lot of cases, for a lot of subnational governments, there is a weak pipeline of projects that are what we call bankable, which means that they are in a state of realization that is strong enough to interest investors. Sometimes this is due to the legal framework, to the ownership rights, or to enforceability of contracts, or the convertibility risk, or the problem of transferring capital in and out of the country. It can be also due to the currency risk, as a lot of countries have a foreign exchange mechanism that are affected by high levels of volatility, etc. In some cases as well, a lot of projects are not doing enough to ensure that there is a complete analysis of the credit risk. In the bond world, a credit rating is really required to demonstrate to investors the level of risk that is being taken by the investors. And sometimes that is lacking. And there are some other inherent risks that are more linked to the financial markets, like the volatility and the risk appetite that sometimes the emerging market countries are subject to, as we have seen in the latest crisis. And the final point is often also there is a problem with low disclosure standards and a problem of transparency around the projects that could affect the ability to make those projects viable for international investors. Now, there are solutions to attract foreign investors, and one of them, which is quite popular and is a positive way to ensure that there is a convergence of interest between public and private stakeholders, is the private-public partnerships. And I'm taking this example from the Philippines, where there is actually an organization that has been set up called the PPP Center that is meant to support the development of projects around private-public partnerships. So not all projects in a country can be organized through a PPP. There are some assets that are owned and operated publicly, and very often like the utilities or some of the civil works that is happening to build infrastructure for roads or for the maritime industry. And so there are some other assets that are fully private already, and there's no need to work on this convergence of interest. However, in the middle, there is a lot of projects that could receive both interest from the private and the public through some operating contracts that reserve some of the investment for the public, for the government, and then some other parts can be managed through a private entity. And there can be contracts that are set up to organize a leasing of certain assets. There can be concessions. There can be build, operate, transfer models or design, build, operate models that can create the conditions for successful realization of this infrastructure. There can be some joint ventures as well. What is very important to make those projects happen as well is to have some form of preparation facility. One of the problems that we see in those projects is that there is often a lack of skills to prepare the climate-aligned projects, as maybe the knowledge hasn't really filtered through yet from the national level to the local level. Another example is in Pakistan. There is a new legislation that has been put in place around private-public partnerships for major cities and secondary towns, and that can be a real opportunity for a lot of projects. Actually, the Pakistan's first green bond is for a water utility project. The company is owned by the government, but it's operated as a separate entity, and it is through a green bond able to finance a number of projects, and some of which later could be also financed through a PPP schemes. When we look at investors that are interested in green bonds, there is actually a very large variety of institutional investors that are attracted to those green bonds, because what we hear from them is that they like the transparency of the green bonds that indicates what types of projects will be financed. They like also the low volatility of those bonds, as they are usually long-dated infrastructure that is less subject to volatility. Also, the buyers of those green bonds are very often what we call buy and hold investors. So they are conservative portfolio managers that tend to keep those bonds in their portfolios to match some of their liabilities. And we also see some specific bonds that have, specific funds that have been set up to invest directly into those bonds. We see, for example, the Green Climate Fund is not investing in bonds, but investing directly in projects. But we also see some exchange-traded funds that have a strategy to directly invest in green bonds. Another example is the EGO fund that has been set up by IFC and Amundi, the asset manager, which has a purpose to directly invest in green bonds. And in this instance, there is a very clear blending of the IFC part, which is public funding, and the Amundi part, which is private funding, in order to modify the economics of this portfolio by IFC providing some kind of support or what we call first loss protection on the fund. There is another example from the Asian Development Bank through the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility. And in some of these examples, there is a way to use portfolio diversification to reduce the risk by combining different projects together and offering them as a package to investors. And that brings me to another opportunity, which we have commented on in one of our reports on the China Securitization Report State of the Market 2020. This example, and that's also in response to one of the questions that was posted on the Q&A here, how to use an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, to finance projects based on in this example, the receipts coming from tickets sold from a metro line. So in this example, you can see that there is at the bottom a number of receivables that will be generated in the future for a metro line. And those receipts, those future receipts against the provision of transport services can be transferred into a special entity, which is a trust or an SPV, that will then issue a green asset-backed security to investors as a way to raise capital. So this is a model that could be used in many locations around the world to create new infrastructure that will have positive cash flows going forward. And it's a way to raise capital to make this infrastructure possible. And without really impacting the fiscal budget of the government, because this can be ring-fenced as a separate project without affecting the public accounts. So that's an interesting model to look at when creating this infrastructure that we need, for example, for transport services, but also it could be done for other types of investments through the securitization of leases or the securitizations of mortgages, etc. So just to sum up a very succinct roadmap for subnational governments, the first point is that there should be a policy to harmonize carbon neutral policies from the national level to the subnational level through frameworks looking at regulations and transfer price and revenue transfers between the national and the subnational level. And this agenda must be aligned with the national agenda. Second, it is important to look at the fiscal framework that supports those carbon initiatives. Sometimes it can be interesting to look at ways to introduce carbon taxes or environmental taxes on top of the transfer of revenues between different levels of governments. Third, it is important to create a sustainability framework for the perimeter of the government. Fourth, there are opportunities to look at innovative ways of financing those climate resilient projects. And fifth, there is a lot of investors that are looking to invest in projects around the world. And the green bonds are the ideal instrument to access this capital for subnational governments, in particular for low carbon projects. And as Abraham has explained, this process is now relatively well understood by many stakeholders, and it becomes easier and easier to issue them. Thank you very much. I remain available for your questions if you have. Otherwise, I turn the mic back to Abraham.
Unmute myself.
Good. Thank you very much, Cedric, for sharing with us all those crucial aspects related to this space. Perhaps I'm sure that our audience may have some questions, so perhaps we can try to address just a few of them before moving on to the next part of our webinar. Cedric, we can see here one coming from Motorica, asking if a local government wants to use bonds as a financial instrument, which department within the local government should kickstart the process and take the lead, and which department should be engaged and support?
So normally there is a department that is in charge of financing, or it's like a treasury function that is the main department in charge of this process. However, very often we see that the treasury will also liaise with other branches of the local governments because some of the projects may be under the responsibility of those entities. And it's an opportunity to organize a collaboration between different departments. So sometimes, for example, the transport investment will be under the Department of Transportation, and the treasury function may not be fully aware of all the projects that are happening in those different departments. So what is really important is to try to develop the dialogue between these different branches of government so that they understand the opportunities that exists.
Great. Thank you very much, Cedric. Perhaps we can just try to address another one. Do you see any issuance opportunities by subnational governments for adaptation projects, Cedric?
Yeah, there are many opportunities. I mean, in adaptation, there are different types of risk, right? One project again that comes to mind is the adaptation of our cities that are very often not really prepared for dealing with some of the risks that come with climate change. You could think of the flood response of our cities. Here in Singapore, there is a very extensive program to develop infrastructure investment into canals and banks alongside the seashore to prevent the rising sea levels. That's an adaptation project that can be a clear opportunity for the future. The question is always whether this should be done by the national government as a public project, or if it can be opened up for private partnership and private participation. So there are many issuance opportunities, yes, by subnational governments.
Thank you very much, Cedric, and thank you everyone for your questions. Please keep on sharing them with us through the chat box. We still have another round of Q&As after the intervention of our next guest speaker, who first of all, I would like to sincerely thank for being here with us. He's making a great effort, staying up late at night to be live with us today. For that, thank you very much, Mike. And perhaps just before giving you the floor, let me just say a few words about you. Everyone, Mike is the manager of green bonds and climate finance initiatives at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. He was the person that took the initiative in the implementation of the issuance of SFPUC's first green bond or green bonds, which has now become a core element of this entity's debt funding program. So as a result of Mike's efforts, his organization has now issued billions and billions of US dollars in green bonds, making his institution one of the largest issuers of municipal bonds in the municipal green bonds in the United States. And of course, to tell us more about his firsthand experience in this process, Mike, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for including me. And it's wonderful to learn about other examples that are occurring around the world, and perhaps what we're doing in the United States may be useful as well, a useful model. I hope so. So I will share a presentation that goes into our experience a bit. Okay, can you see that?
We can see it now.
Great. As Abraham mentioned, it's about 2:30 in the morning here, so forgive me if I seem a little tired. I'll try to perk up. So I'm with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. We're a department of the city of San Francisco, and we provide water, wastewater, and public power services for the city itself and some surrounding counties. And my role in the organization is to basically issue bonds for large capital projects. For water, it can be building a dam or building some other type of resiliency or a new treatment plant, things like that. And we issue the bonds primarily to U.S. investors, though there are some international investors as well. And we pledge we issue revenue bonds, which means we use the rates and charges we get from our customers to repay the bonds. So in the US, there's a very developed municipal market, bond market, subnational bond market. There's something like 40,000 separate issuers. So it's quite a lot. And I know in other countries, there's this also subnational bond market. So there may be an opportunity there. But in the US, actually, and I'll explain a little bit more as I get into the presentation, the green bond market here is really not as advanced as it is in other parts of the world, like Europe. So I'll just get into the presentation. Let's see. There we go. So I think it's been said already in the presentation, Abraham's presentation. There's been about 362 billion, or issued through the first 3 quarters of 2021. So it's been a great year in terms of green bond issuance. There's been a lot of growth in the market, but it's been relatively flat for municipal issuers in the United States. The U.S. municipal bond market is about 400 billion a year. And when you think about the kinds of projects that local governments finance, it's green buildings, it's water projects, could be public transit. A lot of the projects are green bond eligible, or would be green bond eligible, but about only 15 billion is sold as labeled currently. So there's a big opportunity in the US among subnational issuers, in our green bond market, in our municipal market. And why we kind of distinguish it from the corporate bond market, it's a separate market that provides tax exemption for the investors. So when investors in the United States buy our bonds, they don't pay any income tax on the interest payments that we make to them. And so we get basically a subsidy. Our interest cost is reduced because investors are willing to take less interest because they're not taxed on that. But recently we've been issuing taxable refunding bonds for there was a change in our tax code. So that's enabled us really to participate in the larger corporate bond market, which is like trillions, I think 4 trillion or say, it's a huge number, global bond market. And in that market, there's a much greater demand for green bonds. So that's been very exciting. And one of the things, and I'll talk about it in a minute, is we, to attract non-US investors, we actually listed our bonds last year on the London Stock Exchange, which was a really interesting experience. And just to the right, before I leave this page, this is just sort of an update on kind of where we are through 2020 or in 2020 on green, sustainable, and social bonds. It's very interesting. I mean, when I started issuing green bonds in 2015, I don't think there was much, if any, of a sustainability and social bond market. So that's really been a very big change that I've noticed. I have two slides that are pretty similar. This one charts our history issuing green bonds, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And then the next slide, which looks very similar, I'll talk about the benefits. So, because I really want to highlight the benefits that we've experienced. So, in 2015, we issued a self-certified bond for our power enterprise, and I talk about them separately because they are separate credits, meaning we have separate ratings from S&P and Moody's, et cetera, and the revenues that we get for each of these enterprises, we call them enterprises, these utilities, are separated. So there's no cross-subsidization or anything like that. And we don't get transfers from the federal government. So we are, and the city won't backstop us either. So we are solely responsible for repaying our debt. So in 2015, we issued self-certified bonds, as I mentioned, but beginning in 2016, we started to issue CBI certified, Climate Bonds Initiative certified green bonds. In fact, we were the first issuer in the world, I believe, to issue under CBI's water criteria in 2016. So that was very exciting. And then we followed it up over the subsequent years, additional bonds. We signed a green bond pledge in 2018. We won an award, which was great, and from Environmental Finance in 2019. We listed in London Stock Exchange 2020, and actually it's not on here, but we won an award for doing that, which was also very exciting. So it's really nice to be recognized. And in 2021, we actually have a green bond in the market currently, and I haven't added it to the list yet because we haven't closed, but it's for wastewater. And one thing I'll just mention is with CBI, we use Sustainalytics to provide the third-party verification, and we also got programmatic certification. So every time we issue a water bond or a wastewater bond, that's part of this large capital program that we have for each of these utilities. It's a very simple, quite efficient, low-cost process, and it's been very nice, very easy for us. Now I've changed the slide, and I'm just going to talk about some of the benefits. And the benefits, from my perspective, my sort of vantage point is really, are we bringing in new investors? I'm in finance, that's my job, is to get the lowest cost of capital. Are we attracting new investors? Are we lowering our borrowing costs? And that's really what I think has held the growth of green bonds among U.S. muni issuers, is that there isn't a really clear pricing benefit yet, but over the years, as we've been doing this since 2015, we've definitely been attracting new investors. We've been oversubscribed on our deals on certain maturities by green bond investors, and we can say now for sure that we are achieving a pricing benefit as an issuer. So we are saving on taxable bonds, typically around 5 basis points, which doesn't seem like a lot, but these are large transactions, so it does add up. And on tax-exempt bonds, which doesn't probably pertain to too many people watching this webinar, there is a smaller savings, but there's still a measurable savings, maybe 1 or 2 basis points. But so we are very excited about the opportunity to keep issuing green bonds and participating in this market and building climate resilient infrastructure. And I will say that rating agencies are starting to take notice, and our work on climate adaptation was cited as a credit strength on a recent Moody's report. So we're definitely seeing that, and you've also probably noticed that all the rating agencies are buying climate data companies, so they're also taking climate much more seriously. Of course, the insurance companies are taking climate much more seriously. And investors, they're seeing that it's a sign of a credit strength if an issuer is investing in climate adaptation and mitigation. So just just some highlights about our experience at the San Francisco PUC. As I mentioned already, increasing our investor base. The high demand has led to a small but measurable pricing benefit. And one of the other benefits that's been very interesting for me, I've been at the agency for a long time, almost 16 years, and the process of preparing our impact reports has actually taught me a lot about the kinds of activities we're doing in our community. So we have a lot of programs under our community benefits umbrella, like workforce development, investment in the arts, investment in women-owned businesses, many activities, millions of dollars of investment in our community, in our rate base, to strengthen our rate base. And we're now able to communicate that to stakeholders like investors, like rate agencies, and also community members. We've also gotten a lot of, I would say, reputational and marketing benefits. I mentioned the awards we've received. We also have gotten a lot of press coverage. So in the US, there's the publication called the Bond Buyer, which is like our local, our national muni bond newspaper, but also internationally, Environmental Finance has written about us, Reuters, Bloomberg. So it's been very exciting to get the press coverage. So normally when we sell bonds, we would expect to pay maybe $30,000 or $50,000 on marketing. We're not really doing that in recent years because we're getting a pretty good coverage just because we're doing we're issuing label green bonds. We happen to have a lot of detail comparing these two series because it was the same underwriter. That was a question that came through the chat. I'll just say, when we sell bonds, we generally work with underwriters. These are the large banks, that you all know about, Citi, Bank of America, Barclays, etc., Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. So this slide just compares really the growth from 2017 to 2019 in the number of ESG orders. This is a similar transaction, but just kind of highlights how the market is evolving and growing and demonstrating that the demand for green bonds is increasing. This is the cover of our recent green bond impact report for our wastewater enterprise, and we report now on project specific, but also enterprise-wide or department-wide impacts. We indicate how the investments we're making are aligned with our state, local, and departmental goals, both environmental and social goals. And also in response to investor interest, investor requests, we're aligning all of our impacts against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which has been very interesting. And ICMA that came up earlier, they have a very nice crosswalk that facilitated this. So they have a document that helps translate the work you're doing into the UNSDGs. So I really found that very helpful. We're working on a new project now that I'm very excited about, and I think really it's because of green bonds and investor interest that we're making this effort. It's a pilot right now. We have some initial funding. There's a professor out of the University of Washington, Professor Jan Whittington, and she's been working for World Bank recipient countries mostly for the last 10 years or so, but not in the United States, on a tool that screens projects against an issuer's climate goals. So, so if you've signed on to Paris, are the investments you're making now, which may be in the ground for 30, 50, 70 years. In our case, we have assets that are over 100 years old. So are these projects you're building today going to help you meet your climate goals? And so this is just really an example of what the dashboard we hope to build will look like, because we're still in the pilot phase. We don't have we're not able to do this yet. But another thing we've added to the project is not only are we going to be screening projects against our climate goals, but we're also going to screen them against our social inclusion and racial equity goals. We've really come to believe that the investments we're making now, we're making huge investments. As a department, we spend about $1 billion a year on capital, and as a city, about $4 billion a year on capital. And I'm sure there's many people on this call that are spending much more. And then we've come to realize that these investments, you can still achieve the engineering goals and also address the social goals, whether it's local hiring or improved transportation or services for these communities. One project we're looking at is creating employment, creating businesses in aligned services. So like we're producing biosolids from our treatment plant. There's a need for landscape amendment, for soil amendment from landscapers. So perhaps a business could be created to achieve to provide that service and also create jobs. So that's the kind of stuff we're hoping to do. And in closing, I just want to restate some of the things I said. It's been very positive issuing green bonds for us, and I encourage all those that can take advantage of it to absolutely do it. It's been great for generating reputational benefits, media coverage, and in our case, and this may be, if the case for many of you, a lot of the project impact data is already available. It's just a matter of getting it out of documents or talking to the engineers. So that's what we've had to do. It's a little bit difficult at first, but it certainly gets easier. And then with a tool like we hope to have, and the tool we hope to make available to others as well, it'll be much easier because you'll have this data from the very beginning of the project inception. So you'll have it right from the start. You won't need to kind of create it after the fact. And I do definitely believe that there's a great potential to expand one's investor base, lead to lower borrowing costs, especially with taxable bonds, which is, I think everyone on this call would be dealing with taxable bonds. And the great thing about green bonds is it may start to influence project selection, so that more resilient, greener projects are being built. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. We truly appreciate the time you have invested to be here with us, and we sincerely thank you for sharing with all of us your experience. I think it was very valuable for the audience to hear more about an institution that has been directly involved in this agenda, and of course to listen to the real benefits of issuing in this format, and of course the challenges that they might encounter in the process. So perhaps similar to before, I'm sure that our audience may have some questions. I believe we still have some minutes to try to address some of them. Let me just quickly have a look at the Q&A box. There's one question, Mike, related to the duration of the process. How long does the process take? Any tips to fast track?
Well, first I want to say that folks should feel free to contact me anytime. I love talking about green bonds, and always want to support this market. So on the fast track, so I mentioned earlier, we do something called we have programmatic approval. So there it's very fast, and climate bonds actually very fast so there's no new projects being added. But in a typical case, if you have new projects, I think you probably want to allocate about 6 weeks. And maybe climate bonds knows that better than I do. But in terms of issuing a bond, that can take 6 months for us, where it takes forever to we have to update our disclosure document, which is like our prospectus. We call it an official statement. That takes a long time. It's almost 200 pages. It's that's difficult. But the green bond part is pretty fast.
Well, perhaps this question comes from my side, Mike, and it is, I think, a rather straightforward question. Was it worth it? Do you think that issuing in this format compensates for the efforts, cost, or work-wise?
I mean, when I first learned about green bonds, the way it was presented to me from Sean Kidney, from CBI, is that it's really an opportunity to participate in this global effort to make our infrastructure more resilient and be prepared for the coming changes to climate. Over the years, though, I've come to realize that as a finance, government worker, it's really my responsibility to ensure that the infrastructure we're building today is going to meet its intended useful life. So if we're building something that's supposed to last for 70 years, have the engineers checked, all of that, and even in San Francisco, there's people don't trust the projections, or there. So I definitely think it's worth it. I think everyone who's issuing debt now for projects that are green bond eligible, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't do it. You're just there's only benefits as far as I can tell.
Indeed, fully agree with you, Mike. Perhaps another question also related to the San Francisco bonds, coming from Paul. Mike, all the San Francisco bonds are revenue bonds, and there are no credit enhancement from general budget. Is this correct?
Okay. So this may be surprising to people, but within the city of San Francisco alone, there are several separate bond issuing entities. So like there's the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, we're the water, wastewater, power. There's the airport, SFO. They're their own credit. We don't subsidize, or none of us get support from the general budget. Then the general fund, they issue their own debt, and that's general obligation debt. And that comes from property taxes primarily. And that's a general obligation bond, whereas we and the airport issue revenue bonds. Then there's the municipal rail, they issue bonds, the school district issues bonds. So there's a lot of us issuing debt in the city. But that's correct. We don't get any credit support from the general fund.
And Mike, to my point that we should harmonize the objectives, like at the state level, do you guys talk to each other to harmonize the types of frameworks that you have in place, or the policies that you implement?
Of course not. We're trying, actually. There is something in California which is great, called the California Green Bond Market Development Committee. So we are trying to create California wide, as you described, harmonized framework. We've been working on it for a while. Hopefully we'll have something, but it's so fragmented here. But we're trying to come up with a framework for California issuers. Yeah, no, but I totally agree. It'd be
And
great.
do you see
Actually,
a
that's
point?
what issuers want to know, is they feel confused when I talk to them. We don't know what framework, we don't know what the reporting requirements are, so we do need to make it easier.
And do you see a point where all your bonds being issued will be green?
Well, that's right. So that's actually the goal with this tool that I mentioned earlier. I want to be able to screen every project, and ideally, even if it's like repairing a pothole, can we make that a green bond? We do a lot of work that's just replacing what was there before. So I'm not sure, but I really hope we can. I at least want to be able to tell investors and others that every single project has been screened for climate. But my goal, my desire would be that everything is eligible to be issued as green, for sure. I mean, I think that's the only way we're going to get to our goal.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much, Cedric, for sharing with us that very insightful information. For the audience, as you mentioned before, please feel free to contact us. We know there are still some pending questions in the chat box, so please do not hesitate to reach out if you wish to have further information on this space. And of course, we can always respond to the pending questions via via email. Just before closing this, I would like to invite my colleague Isabella one last time, because I believe we still have one last polling question. Is that right, Isabella?
It is right, Abraham. Thank you. So before we close our session, everyone, we would like to hear from you. What kind of learning formats would you be interested in experiencing our course when we develop this course for local governments issuing thematic labeled bonds? Would you like to see content presentations, videos from guest speakers, group exercises, plenary discussions, case studies, or polling questions? I have to launch that for you to be able to answer, and there you go. All right, everyone. Yeah, we see a lot of interest here for case studies. In addition to content presentations, video from guest speakers, group exercises, and plenary discussions, but case studies is leading the polls. Very well. So I'll give you another 10 seconds to go through this one. And once again, thank you very much for your contribution. It's very important for us to hear from you, for us to be able to develop our course and develop something that is suitable to our target audience, which are local governments. So let's say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there you go. Now you can see case studies are leading the polls here. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing my screen and over to you, Abraham.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Well, just on my side, to close this session, I would just like to stress that, and very much aligned with what my colleagues just said, we should not forget that the ultimate goal of all of these efforts is just to contribute to a sustainable development, and we should always try to have that in mind when making investment decisions and when deciding to issue debt for projects. We should not forget that green bonds are just one of the many useful instruments in the market that can help us achieve the global goals. But again, it's up to you to decide how you wish to contribute to their attainment. Thank you very much again to all my colleagues, Alicia, Isabella, Cedric, and Mike, for this inspiring and very educational session, and to all of our attendees for being here. Please do not forget that CBI provides help and support in this agenda, and that there are many other resources available in our platform that we definitely encourage you to take a look at. Thank you all again, but just before leaving, I believe my colleague Alicia has also some closing remarks and very important information to share with you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abraham, for the great presentation. Thanks again to our guest speakers, Mike and Cedric. Amazing experience shared, and also we continue to gather your comments and reminding all of you that this work that we are doing is to create a tailored course for the issuance of thematic label bonds to benefit cities and municipalities all over the world. So to continue our process, we are asking you the kindness, if you could spare 3 to 5 minutes to fill a very, very short feedback form we will put here on the chat box, and we hope that you can help us continue making sure that your comments are reflected in the course that we are creating. That will be released to the world in February next year, and will be available on the dashboard for the city's participants of the MCR 2030. And nothing but last, please remember that we will the recording of this webinar will be available on the Climate Bonds YouTube channel, and also on the dashboard of the MCR 2030. And again, on behalf of Climate Bonds, many thanks for your presence. We continue this journey, and Isabella, we will share the presentations on the thank you email that we'll send to everybody. So thanks for attending. Have a wonderful end of your day or evening. Hope you get to enjoy the session and stay in touch.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much.
Have a good sleep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.